Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 116 of the Standing Committee of the House of Commons on Public Accounts.
Members are attending in person in the room and remotely and potentially, but I think everyone is here. Conformément à l'article 108.
Pursuant to Standing Order 1083G, the committee is undertaking its study of Report 3, First Nations and Inuit Policing Program, 2024. From the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, referred to the committee on Tuesday, March 19, 2024. Before beginning, I would like to remind all members and other participants in this meeting present in this room of preventive measures as the following.
We have a different setup today to prevent disruptive and potentially harmful audio feedback incidents that can cause injuries. All in-person participants are reminded to keep their earpieces away from all microphones at all time.
As indicated in the Speaker's communique of April 29th, sent to all members of Parliament, the following measures have been taken to help prevent acoustic incidents. All earpieces have been replaced with a model that considerably reduces the risk of an acoustic incident. The new earpieces are black, whereas the old ones were gray. Please only use an approved black earpiece. By default, all unused earpieces will be unplugged at the beginning of the meeting.
Please place it face down on the middle of the sticker for this purpose that you will find on the table as indicated. Please consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. The room layout has been adjusted to increase the distance between microphones and reduce the chance of feedback from an ambient earpiece. So the witnesses are all spread out as well as members. I am going to speak to at the liaison committee about adding some room for witnesses as well as members going forward. But for now, we're going to have to work through this process because these measures are in place so we can conduct our business without harming the interpreters, and to ensure they're safe and healthy is safeguarded at all times. Merci à tous pour votre coopération.
I thank you all for your cooperation. And I remind you once again that all interventions from members and witnesses are through the chair.
I'd like to welcome our witnesses from the Office of the Auditor General, Karen Hogan, Auditor General of Canada, Joanne Swartz, Principal, Mélanie Joannis, Director. Nice to see you all here today. From the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Sean Tupper, Deputy Minister. Nice to see you. Chris Moore, nice to see you as well. Assistant Deputy Minister, Indigenous Affairs Branch. And from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Brian Larkin. Nice to see you. Deputy Commissioner, Specialized Policing Services, and Warren Brown, Assistant Commissioner, Indigenous and Support Services. Each organization will be given a maximum of 5 minutes for your remarks. After that, we'll proceed to our rounds of questionings. There will be votes, possibly bells early. I will look for consent if we want to proceed in our allotted time, but I'll do that when the bells begin. So without further ado, Ms. Hogan, you have the floor for up to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity to discuss our report on the First Nations and Inuit Policing Program, which was tabled in Parliament on the 19th of March 2024. I would like to acknowledge that this hearing is taking place on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. This area is also known as Ottawa. I express my gratitude and respect to all Indigenous peoples who have contributed to shaping and safeguarding the beautiful lands they call home throughout Canada. Joining me today are Joanne Swartz, the principal who was responsible for the audit, and Mélanie Joannis, the director who led the audit team. The First Nations and Inuit Policing Program was created in 1991. We last audited this program in 2014, 10 years ago, and again, this time we found critical shortcomings in how it is being managed. Public Safety Canada is the lead in managing and overseeing the program. We found that the department did not work in partnership with Indigenous communities to provide equitable access to policing services that were tailored to their needs. Through the program's community tripartite agreements, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the RCMP, delivers dedicated policing services that supplement the ones from the province or territory. We found that the RCMP did not work in partnership with Indigenous communities to provide proactive policing services.
Significantly increased over the last 10 years, we found that $13 million of funds earmarked for the 2022-23 fiscal year went unspent. As of October 2023, Public Safety Canada anticipated that over $45 million of program funds would be left undispersed at the end of the 2023-24 fiscal year. This is concerning in the context of a program intended to support the safety of Indigenous communities. Public Safety Canada did not have an approach to allocate funds equitably to communities. The department told us that it relied on the province's or territories' readiness to fund their share of the program and on past funding received by communities to determine the amounts allocated. Over the past 5 years, the RCMP has been unable to fully staff the positions funded under the community tripartite agreements. This leaves First Nations and Inuit communities without the level of proactive and community-focused policing services that they should receive. Lastly, neither Public Safety Canada nor the RCMP could identify whether requirements set out in policing agreements were being met and whether the program was achieving its intended results. It is important to monitor and analyze data to not only meet the community's security and safety needs, but also to support the self-determination of communities. Given that this program has not been updated since 1996 and long-standing issues persist, Public Safety Canada must work with First Nations and Inuit communities, provinces and territories, as well as the RCMP, to find a way to more effectively provide proactive and culturally appropriate policing services. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We'll be pleased to answer any questions the committee members may have. Thank you.
Auditor. Turning now to Mr. Tupper from the Department of Public Safety Emergency Preparedness. I'm having a tough time today. Over to you for 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, committee members, thank you for inviting me and my Assistant Deputy Minister, Chris Morin, to appear before you today here in the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Je suis heureux d'avoir la possibilité de parler.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak about the Auditor General of Canada's Performance Audit Report on the First Nations and Inuit Policing Program. Since 1991, the program has provided cost-matched funding to support access to dedicated, culturally responsive policing services in First Nations and Inuit communities. This program supports 36 self-administered police services which provide community policing in more than 155 First Nation and Inuit communities.
Tight stream, the program also provides funding to support an enhanced level of policing in communities that are served by the RCMP. This cost-matching approach supports investments in an area of provincial territorial jurisdiction, and Public Safety Canada is committed to improving the program in collaboration with provinces and territories of jurisdiction with First Nations and Inuit communities. In response to the Auditor General's Performance Audit Report, Public Safety has developed a preliminary action plan to address the report's recommendations. We are calling it preliminary because of the importance of engaging with First Nation and Inuit partners and the provinces and territories to do this work. That said, the Department has already started taking action to address the Auditor General's recommendations. The Department has recently aligned the delivery of programs, Indigenous policing and community safety policy, and engagement and considerations into a single branch to create more efficient, coherent program delivery and to improve the integration of policy on Indigenous issues within the public safety mandate. Bien qu'il y ait beaucoup à faire, le fait d'avoir
While there is much to do, having a clear line of accountability will help to ensure that it gets done. This branch is working with provinces and territories and First Nation and Inuit communities to identify improvements to program governance with a view to delivering its cost-matching funding faster.
Indigenous-led regional and national engagement sessions have been held over the winter on proposed legislative options to advance the minister's mandate to co-develop federal legislation to recognize First Nation police services as essential services. The government also reiterated its commitment to this initiative in Budget 2024. The engagement sessions build on ongoing collaboration Public Safety Canada has fostered with First Nations and subject matter experts like the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association and First Nations Police Governance Council, as well as provincial and territorial representatives. Public Safety is also revisiting the program management relationship with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to more readily consider and integrate officer availability in program management decisions. And the RCMP are continuing to work with communities to improve cultural awareness practices as they reaffirm their commitment to keeping Indigenous communities safe, including through the First Nations and Inuit Policing Program. Dans toutes ces initiatives,
Through all of these initiatives, collaboration is key. Public Safety will continue to work closely with First Nations and Inuit partners, law enforcement agencies, and provinces and territories.
making decisions on the level of policing needs in their jurisdiction, and consistent with this, they drive decisions on investment priorities for this program by providing 48% of the costs, which the federal government then meets with the remaining 52% within its funding allocation. This approach presents challenges, and Public Safety is aware of the opportunity and is undertaking the necessary work to improve program governance and, in turn, delivery and outcome. The audit report will inform this shared work, help strengthen our ability to overcome challenges, and ensure the continued success of the FNIPP program. I know that commitment to reconciliation is top of mind in every step we take on this shared path with our Indigenous partner. Ce travail a une incidence directe sur
This work directly affects the safety and security of the Indigenous communities who rely on these services.
report recommended improvements in fostering collaboration. We aim to create a safer environment, build stronger relationships with Indigenous communities, and ensure that their unique needs are met. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And finally, from the RCMP, Mr. Larkin, you have the floor for about 5 minutes, please.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. Sur notre
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of Mr. Duhem, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today on the 2024 report to the Auditor General on the First Nations and Inuit Policing Program.
by Assistant Commissioner Warren Brown, who oversees our Indigenous policing and our community engagement program as a part of our contract in Indigenous policing here at National Headquarters in Ottawa. All Canadians have the right to receive culturally responsive and respectful police services. Indigenous communities and reconciliation are one of the RCMP's key strategic priorities, the primary goal of which is to contribute to a healthy, safety, and ensuring a prosperous Indigenous community. Under the FNIPP, the RCMP works with external partners, including Public Safety Canada, to coordinate efforts to contribute to the safety of these communities by providing professional, dedicated, and responsive services to First Nation and Inuit peoples. The RCMP is committed to addressing systemic racism and discrimination while remaining dedicated to strengthening trust with our First Nations communities, our Inuit communities, and the Métis peoples, as well as communities and employees. The RCMP is focused on making decisions, on developing policies, developing programs and practices, as well as training that are informed by evidence, that are responsive to community needs, and are culturally appropriate. Changes have been informed and guided through increased engagement with Indigenous leaders, consultative groups, elders, and youth, as well as in collaboration with government department partners such as the Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, Women and Gender Equality Canada, the Department of Justice, as well as Public Safety Canada. The FNIPP, for example, enhances community policing services, supports culturally responsive policing within the First Nation Inuit communities that we serve, and recognizes input from Indigenous communities on the policing services received. The RCMP are service providers under the FNIPP through the community tripart agreements contracted to provide policing services to a First Nation or Inuit community. In March of this year, the RCMP welcomed the Office of the Auditor General's report on the FNIPP. We believe that by implementing the Auditor General's recommendations, the RCMP can help improve the delivery of police services under this program. We want to be clear that the RCMP agrees and supports the recommendations of the OAG report and will commit to working with all stakeholders, all partners to address the issues raised, as well as contribute to a significantly strong action plan. The action plan will respect the jurisdiction of provinces and territories over operational policing, reconfirming the role of the federal government as a financial contributor, and respond to audit recommendations to improve the strategic focus and the measurable impact of the program. Beyond the program, though, the RCMP continues to work with communities to make cultural awareness part of the process for all new RCMP regular members who are joining this program and joining our organization. We are also prioritizing their participation and inclusion in localized cultural events. Building strong relations with Indigenous communities is extremely important to the RCMP. In the spirit of reconciliation, we look to continue to establish enhanced trust within the communities that we serve. In addition to the FNIPP, the RCMP has implemented the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis recruitment strategy, which was launched in 2023. We've advanced efforts for sharing of information related to various Indigenous communities with regular members. We are supporting regular members in reporting on their participation in various activities in communities and reconciliation efforts for information and awareness sharing. We continue to work with all communities to make cultural awareness a part of the community onboarding process for our police officers. The RCMP will continue to work with communities to upload their safety and to build and strengthen relationships that are based on mutual respect, trust, and have the interests of the communities at the heart. I once again want to reaffirm that we accept the OAG recommendations and we look forward to working with all of our partners to advance and to strengthen the communities that we serve. Again, thank you on behalf of Commissioner Dehem for inviting us to appear before you today. We look forward to the questions. Merci beaucoup à tous.
Thank you all very much. Beginning our first round of questions, the first four members will each have 6 minutes each. Mr. Malillo, you are beginning for us. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to join your committee today as a guest, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. The Auditor General, good to see you again. I know you were at Indigenous Affairs yesterday, so we're keeping you busy this week. We appreciate all of your time and efforts on this important issue. And I'll start with you, Auditor General. Thank you for answering the questions yesterday and being present. In the report, you also found that public safety was not monitoring the policing program's effectiveness and not analyzing the information that's being provided by First Nation and Inuit police services. I believe a similar finding was found for the RCMP. I'm wondering if you can speak to that on how that's played out and how that has been impacting the service that's being provided.
So I'll take a first crack at it, and I'll see if Joanne or Melanie might want to add something. What we were looking for was to see whether they knew whether they were first meeting the requirements of the agreements. And what we found is that in most cases, the RCMP was unable to tell us whether a police officer had spent 100% of their time dedicated to the community as they were supposed to. In the detachments that we looked at, there was only 38% of them who could tell us that they were really dedicating their time to a culturally appropriate approach to policing services. When it came to public safety, I would outline a few things. The first would be that they weren't monitoring how the RCMP was spending those funds, but then weren't really gathering the data on the effectiveness, right? They were gathering response rates and so on, which is really the traditional way to look at policing. How many calls did you answer or so on, versus were you actually in the community building trust in different relationships? So I'll see if you want to add anything to that, either of you, or did I do okay? Okay.
Thank you for that. I think one other element that we could mention is for both the entities, We found a lack of monitoring related to gender diverse or women in terms of if they were looking to see if the information that they were collecting would show them any trends or changes that they need to make with regard to the services that they were providing.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I won't repeat what we talked about yesterday, but just I want to build off of it because you highlighted, of course, a number of issues, Auditor General. And I think the overarching thing we come back to is moving towards self-administered agreements and moving towards a place where First Nation and Inuit policing services are recognized as essential is where we want to be and where we need to be. Public safety mentioned that that's something that they've been working on, and I'll come to you in a minute here. But the former Minister for Public Safety mentioned, I believe it was September 2022, that the legislation will be just around the corner. Now, of course, that's a pretty wide corner because we're a couple of years out and we still don't have that legislation brought forward. So can you speak to that gap that exists where and how that could be fixed by declaring these, recognizing these services as essential and moving towards self-administered agreements?
So I'm not going to comment on the speed at which bills or legislation moves through Parliament. I'll leave that to all parliamentarians to adjust as they see fit. When it comes to, however, deciding that services should be essential, I think it comes with recognizing that you need to understand the full demand for those services. And right now, one of the findings in our audit report was that public safety doesn't know that full demand, whether it be that there isn't an application process to know how many other communities might want it or what the full need is. Right now, it's about using the funds available to beef up services under existing agreements. We didn't see much expansion. We saw a small expansion into the north, but not much expansion, and no community moving between a tripartite agreement into a self-administered. While one did move right after the end of our audit period, that's very little progress for the additional funding that was put to the program with the purpose of expanding it. So I think to define it as essential needs to come with knowing what that means. What will that mean for the federal government to fund this appropriately?
Absolutely. Just very quickly with my remaining time, I'll go to public safety now because, of course, as we just spoke about, it's been many years, and this legislation recognizing the essential nature of this work isn't there, and I think that's a concern for a number of people, especially in my region, around Treaty 3 area now, where that police service is operating without any agreement whatsoever. There's also the case that $45 million of program funds was estimated to be left on the table just because of the clause of these tripartite agreements. And of course, that's not an acceptable excuse for people that are needing these essential services. So if I can ask public safety, what is being done to rectify that, to ensure that the dollars allocated are able to be spent, and what's being done to expedite the process of moving that essential legislation?
With respect to the legislation, it is taking longer than we might have anticipated, but I think doing it in a co-developed way, making sure that we have a process that is acceptable to our Indigenous partners, agreeing on the mandate in terms of how we would develop that legislation has not been an easy task. I think we find ourselves in a position now with the provinces and territories where there's general understanding of the intent of the essential legislation, essential services legislation, but we have varied voices within the Indigenous community. We have been engaged with the AFN since the beginning of our efforts, and we have been traveling the country to engage with communities and leadership within the policing community. It is just simply the struggle of co-developing legislation in a way that we are not typically asked to develop legislation, and so it's taking longer. With respect to money left on the table, we are a program that flows funds against expenses in the program. We do find ourselves at the end of fiscal years in situations where not all the money that has been identified for spending has been spent, and therefore the money doesn't flow. That's to ensure that it is not going out the door and becoming used in other ways in other programs. And so we are stuck in a situation where a province may choose not to match the fund, and therefore we can't flow the funds. It may be, as we have seen in recent years, simply a labour market choice where the RCMP are unable to fully staff their vacant positions as a result of labour market challenges, and consequently the money doesn't get spent.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Turning to Mr. Chen, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the Auditor General, to the witnesses that are here before this committee today. I understand that through this program, the provinces, not all of them have a provincial police force. So my question is, what sort of challenges presents itself when we are trying to ensure that there is a community tripartite agreement under this specific program in provinces where there is no provincial police force?
You want me to do that? Okay. So the CTAs, the tripartite arrangements, are the result of the fact that we have RCMP in all of the provinces and territories, save for Ontario and Quebec. So in Ontario and Quebec, because we can make different arrangements directly with the communities under their legislation, you see the predominance of the self-administered agreements there. And it's just simply a design of how the law works in those jurisdictions, and the advantage that we have at times of having the RCMP in place in other jurisdictions. Technically, all provinces have provincial police services, and that is availed to them through the contract that we enter into with the provinces and territories that don't have their own provincial police service. So indeed, there is police on the ground that would be considered provincial police, and that is done through the contract that we have.
Fantastic. So I understand that the number of RCMP officer positions under this community tripartite agreement has increased in terms of positions available, but the number of positions filled has been rather consistent over the past few years. So can you share with this committee what are some of the challenges besides the remoteness of the location of these positions in recruiting and attracting talented people to fill these jobs?
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. And as Deputy Tupper alluded to, one of the challenges in the last couple of years has been the labor market, although we're seeing significant change. And so we do anticipate a much more positive outlook as we look at 2024 and beyond. It's no secret that across the country, the RCMP has been dealing with recruitment and vacancy issues in all areas of provincial policing, municipal policing, federal policing, and specialized policing. We currently sit at a national rate of about 15% vacancy. However, I can tell you that this has been one of Commissioner Dehem's national priorities, and hence to assist with this, we've actually recently created a senior leadership role that is solely focused on national recruiting, around onboarding, as well as making our process much more seamless, much more proactive base, attracting coast to coast to coast, as well as a significant lens around reflecting the communities we serve. And we're seeing significant actual change in our recruiting numbers. And Depot, although we are attritioning more than we are actually recruiting right now, and that's largely based on we did lose. Depot was closed for a period of time throughout the pandemic, and so we are playing catch-up. But I'm pleased to announce that this year we anticipate 40 full troops of 32 regular members, and we anticipate in the next fiscal year to increase that to 50 troops. And of course, we're exploring other different ways of bringing direct entry members into organization, experienced police officers. We're also, and I'll turn to Assistant Commissioner Brown, from an Indigenous perspective, though, one of the challenges that we're dealing with is obviously we do have some remote areas, but we're looking at different opportunities, different servicing models to support those communities. But we're also proud to announce that this is the 30th year of our Indigenous pre-cadet process, where we actually welcome Indigenous young persons into our organization to get an understanding of what depot looks like, what training looks like. And we've also added this year the first ever in a long time Indigenous troop, so 32 Indigenous members of the RCMP participating in a complete troop. We hope to continue to advance that, and we've actually launched a recruiting strategy that is focused around Indigenous. But Assistant Commissioner Brown, I'll turn to you for some other challenges around other than just remoteness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for a little perspective, the RCMP, we police in 146 community tripartite agreements. That's 443 regular members. We have 30 positions vacant right now. That's our latest statistics. That's approximately 11% vacancy pattern compared to Deputy Commissioner 15% reference to our contract policing overall. So I'm not saying that's fantastic, but that's positive in that we're not going the other way. We also police 22% of Canada's population, which is 75% of our land mass. There's 647 detachments, 556 of those detachments police in Indigenous communities. That's 489 First Nations, that's 36 Inuit communities, and 31 Métis settlements. No two Indigenous communities are the same. Some are more remote. There's different cultures, different practices. There's different levels of engagement. So I would say this is a really, really good opportunity. Thank you to the Auditor General's report to give us a foundation of what gaps we have and how to move forward more positively with Public Safety Canada.
Thank you. I note that the Auditor General identified 61 funded positions that remain vacant. So it does sound like things are going in the right direction. My final question to the Auditor General is that the First Nations and Inuit Police Program was created in 1991, last updated in 1996 through your work in auditing other comparable programs in the federal government. Is this common that we have a program that is based off a policy from 1996?
I'll have to tell you, I think it depends. The right answer is really it depends. Why we highlight it here as really something that needs to be looked at is when we audited this program the first time in 2014, that was one of the concerns raised then, is that there were constraints because of the 1991 policy that had been updated in 1996 and that it was still constraining. So we made a recommendation in 2014 to fix your policy. That's something that you can easily do, and we find that that is still a position given to us from public safety, and so it really is time, if it's restrictive, to fix it.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Monsieur Lemire.
Now we'll have Mr. Lemire for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the members for your welcome. In Quebec, all of the agreements with First Nations and Inuit are self-administered agreements, and either the First Nation or Inuit group manage their own police service according to provincial regulations. And Ms. Hogan, I thank you for your report. You said that the department is not able to identify the extra resources they put towards these agreements. So how is that possible in 2024? Well, I'm going to ask Melanie if she might want to add to this, but this is an issue that concerns me when there are additional funds that have been allocated for a given reason, and then the department is not in a position to tell us that it's being used as it was intended to be. So the focus really was on improving the existing services rather than broadening the program. And their technological systems or information systems didn't have the details to show us how they use the funds. So I don't know, Melanie, if I really described that adequately, but it's a shortcoming within their own technology systems. Thank you. My next question is for public safety. So, Mr. Tupper, in the same passage, it says that those responsible from public safety said that the department didn't have an IT system that's modern to properly oversee the details of the problem and ensure that there is follow-up. So, Can you tell me how this is done normally within public safety? How do you manage the money that we allocate to you?
Program, I think at the time that that particular infusion of funds came in, decisions were made jointly with the provinces and territories to allocate that money against where we thought the highest priorities were. And in that instance, I think decisions were made that were intended to invest in the program to stabilize it and grow it in terms of its current footprint. And so there is only a small opportunity to grow the program. That was a joint decision with the provinces and territories. It goes against what the government had identified in terms of its intent. But it was the simple challenge that we had in terms of the amount of money we had against the kind of investment that we could make. And we chose to stabilize the program as opposed to grow it and keep it thin, perhaps unstable across the board. I won't defend my IT system in the department. The department has, over time, not made the investments it needs to make. Those are oftentimes expensive investments, and we have simply not been able to sustain an IT system that allows us to do the kind of data analytics that we need to do. And this is something that I am looking at now and trying to figure out ways that I can find the cash to make that kind of investment. That's a department-wide challenge that I have.
Merci pour votre réponse.
Thank you for your answer. To the Auditor General, actually, the RCMP are currently, they haven't signed the agreement, so they know what needs to be signed and what the needs are so they can better fill the positions that are open and provide fair and equitable services. So clearly, this is related to our key findings, whether it's in terms of housing or potable water. We really have to ensure that these services are provided. So it's both. My question is both for the RCMP and for public safety. What priority do you give to these issues in your action plans?
I think we can do better between the two organizations in aligning the work that we do and identifying the kinds of resource demands that we have. Again, it is one of the struggles of going through these audits, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I was around in a previous capacity for the last audit. It isn't a black and white situation. The reality for us is we are entering into the domain of provincial jurisdiction. We do not make these decisions on our own. The identification of resources and whatnot are oftentimes determined by the jurisdiction, which in this case is provincial or territorial. And we have to work in all jurisdictions with all of the entities that are involved. We need to do better, and certainly between our portfolio, we have already taken steps, I think, to get ourselves better aligned to make sure that resource allocations are more transparent.
Je vous remercie parce qu'effectivement, l'exercice.
Thank you, because this isn't a simple exercise. When you look at the people around the table, I thank you for your transparency under the circumstances. And obviously, I think that police services are critical and that the role that they play should be valued in our society. I also recognize the importance of Indigenous police services, and I think that it should be recognized as an essential service. But I'd still like to ask the question. There are amounts that are unspent, and at the same time, I have the impression that there are funds lacking in public safety in Canada. So is there sometimes an amount of money that was allocated to Indigenous communities that you've spent elsewhere because it seemed more important to you than the development of these programs?
I would say the program, if we had an application process, would be oversubscribed. I think we have a very clear sense that there is demand out there for the program. So we do not have sufficient funding to cover all of the need in Indigenous communities across the land. There's no question about that. Part of the challenge of the essential service legislation is to try and demark how we evaluate and how we can determine what that demand is. It is a recognition that it is essential, that the policing shouldn't be a grant and contribution program that is fluid over time as governments make decisions about where to put money or not. So the whole point and intent of that legislation would be to establish that platform and create a secure planning cycle. I think the other challenges that we have that the report identifies is the need to do longer planning cycles. to not have automatic renewals, to not wait too long to re-engage with communities, to make sure that we understand the needs that are there. And those are things that we will build in to the program as we move forward, and are part very much driven by the work we're doing with Indigenous communities on the legislation.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to preface my comments today with a very important note for any survivors of sexual assault in Canada who may be watching this or who may be interested in the topics related to the RCMP and their participation or acknowledgement of sexual assault across Canada, particularly of Indigenous women, that this is a content warning for much of my discussion here. And so I do want to be very privy to that and support women and gender diverse folks who are survivors of this. And I will be prefacing my comments and my further questions in relation to the status of sexual assault within the RCMP and by the RCMP. I want to acknowledge as well that there's an immense history in Canada that directly pertains to the RCMP's involvement and direct participation in the project of colonization in North America. I was privy to the Pope coming to Canada to apologize for the Church's role in the horrific residential school system. My family received a note from the then Prime Minister Stephen Harper for the horrendous treatment of children, and the apology by the Government of Canada to the survivors, including my grandmother. One of the worst things that Canada has ever done, and a sin we have to acknowledge continuously, because it hasn't changed, is these systems and how they continue to affect Indigenous people today. The fact that a country like Canada, the British Isles, can send so many to attack so many others, innocent people. The attack and humiliation of men, my ancestors, when the Northwest Mounted Police was created, the toppling of the Red River Métis settlement and the destruction of Batoche was the core mandate of the Northwest Mounted Police. It is the founding mandate of the RCMP today. This founding mandate is carried on continuously. Institutions would continue through the church and through the government to take children after our men were beaten and wounded. They would attack the children. And then finally, they would take women, the life givers, the water bearers of our nation. And today, the RCMP is still conducting participation in the violence against women. Mr. Larkin, you speak about a respect of Indigenous people. Continuously in the news, you don't have to look that far. RCMP are continuously engaged in this violence. Continuously. I'm going to quote from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry in its final report. It was blunt in its assessment. It said, quote, "The RCMP have not proven to Canada that they are even capable of holding themselves accountable." This is a policy failure of a government that is not interested in holding those who perpetrate violence accountable. The RCMP, by Indigenous persons' own claim, can't hold themselves accountable. So who are we to turn to when we pick up the phone and realize the very same perpetrators of sexual violence are the RCMP? You can imagine my tremendous frustration with this. If it was your family, if it was your mothers, if it was your grandmothers, if it was your daughters, imagine the pain. Imagine it for a moment, Mr. Larkin. Imagine that pain of an auntie having to succumb to this kind of violence. I can't speak to this extreme violence as someone who hasn't particularly been involved in this work, but I do know that my colleague Leah Gazan, the Member of Parliament from Winnipeg Centre, has done a tremendous job attempting to hold Canada accountable for the crisis that is the murdered and missing Indigenous women. She spoke to me of a case stemming from Manitoba. You may be familiar with it. It was in relation to RCMP Constable Kevin Theroux, who took an intoxicated Aboriginal woman he arrested out of a cell, drove her to his northern Manitoba home to pursue, quote, "a personal relationship," end quote. According to an RCMP adjudication document obtained by the CBC, fellow officers teased and goaded him by text message to see, quote, "how far he would go," end quote. and another constable observed flirting between Thoreau and the woman, saying that he, quote, jokingly made a comment about having a threesome with her. The senior officer in the detachment said, quote, it wasn't right, end quote, for Thoreau to take the woman out of the custody, but finally said, quote, you arrested her, you can do whatever the F you want to her, end quote. This isn't just today. Maria Campbell, a remarkable Métis person and survivor of the violence that she had to witness during the clearing of the plains that you participated in, recounted a story in her book, Half-Breed, recounting her time being raped by an RCMP member at the age of 14. He had simply dragged her into a bedroom of her own home where the RCMP members had come to hassle the family about alleged poaching. RCMP sexual abuse of Indigenous women and girls is an open secret well known by Indigenous communities. This is a tremendous pain in our country today. The reports suggest in our Auditor General's report, and I would say it needs to go much further. It needs to recount, Madam Auditor General, the true history of the project that is the RCMP's core mandate. It must go beyond training. It must focus on accountability. It must focus on individuals being held to true account, supervisors, commissioners cannot continue to be complacent in this violence. Just recently, just 3 days ago, there was a case where a mounted RCMP officer was charged with child sexual exploitation in St. Paul, Alberta. When is this going to end? When will the RCMP take seriously their history, account for that history, and be accountable to the many lives you've affected and continue to affect today? When?
Thank you very much, Mr. Desjardins. Beginning the start of our next round, Mr. Bierson, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today and the Auditor General for her report. We've been seeing a lot of her lately, and I appreciate all the work she does. Over the last few years, we've seen a fairly dramatic increase in online child exploitation, and basically any child with a connection to the internet is at risk. In particular, we've had several boys commit suicide who have been exploited through video game chats. A year ago, I had an opportunity to visit the RCMP's National Child Exploitation Center, and got to see the work that Mr. Larkin does there. I'm just wondering, Mr. Larkin, is your department what's your department seeing when it's coming? Any trends around this, and how does this interface with some of the child exploitation that we see happening around First Nation communities, but also that's happening from Canada to other countries around the world? I recently had the ambassador from the Philippines complimenting Canada on our cooperation with the Philippines, but also frustrated that we don't necessarily have the same presence in the Philippines like some other countries do. We have one RCMP officer stationed in the Philippines, where other countries will have a significant number of police officers because the exploitation happens across the border. It's often Canada. Canada is the number 4 source country for perpetrators coming to the Philippines or exploiting from Canada to the Philippines. So just wondering if we can get a bit of a picture of what's going on with that from your perspective.
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. In relation to online child sexual exploitation, impacting First Nation communities and anywhere in Canada for that matter. We recognize that those that prey on the most vulnerable do not discriminate. And so our First Nation communities are susceptible, and actually a significant amount of work needs to be done in our First Nation communities across the country, not only from an investigative perspective, from a proactive prevention and education perspective, and there's significant work happening. The National Child Exploitation is celebrating its 20th anniversary, and so it's an opportune time to look at the way we deploy and the work that we're doing, and in partnership with Witness Protection, looking at enhancing and strengthening that program. However, specifically speaking to Philippines, as you're aware and you mentioned, we have deployed one officer, a child exploitation subject matter expert to that country. We just actually had a team from national headquarters from the program area travel to Philippines to meet with Philippine authorities, meet with police officials, government officials, as well as our member there to do a review and an evaluation of the program to see whether or not it requires enhancement. And so as we look at our deployment across, we currently touch 73 countries across the world from a liaison perspective, but obviously recognizing some of the different challenges. And so the program review is not complete in relation to the Philippines to see whether or not we will adjust and/or redeploy or strengthen our commitment there. But that is certainly on the radar as we continue to look at how do we strengthen this. Child exploitation remains a significant challenge and issue in our country that requires a significant amount of work to be done.
In terms of human trafficking victims in this country, we know that the stakeholders have told me that around 4% of our population is Indigenous, yet of the victims that they're helping, and these are the ones that we know of, about 50% of the victims that we help are Indigenous. Is there a particular focus from the RCMP on how do we help these victims? How do we bring these cases to resolution? What's your perspective on that?
So thank you for the question through you, Mr. Chair. The National Child Exploitation Center does have a complete victim identification center. And so those officers are largely focused on identifying victims of the crime and working with tracking and finding and locating those individuals. Clearly, it's an area that needs to be strengthened. Quite frankly, when you look at the underreported crime of child exploitation as well as the volume, it becomes a significant challenge. And so there's much work to be done in that particular piece. But I'm going to ask Assistant Commissioner Warren Brown to talk about several initiatives that are specific to Indigenous communities.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A recent example I could provide is our engagement with some of the national Indigenous organizations, including Inuit communities. Many of the Inuit communities have young adults and children come down to larger hubs, some hubs that we do not police, a different police of jurisdiction, where concern is a high disproportionate rate of human trafficking. Again, as Deputy Larkin had mentioned, it's underreported. The challenge is to identify and build trust, strengthen those relationships to ensure that a higher accuracy of reporting is brought to our attention. From a national lens, we're responsible for policing 13 divisions in Canada. So again, when we police 22% of the population, it's important that we engage and improve partnerships with some of the bigger police organizations. So that's an endeavor before us, but I appreciate your concern, and it's certainly something that we're trying to get a better stance on.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today, and thank you, Auditor General, for this very, very important and timely report. It is important to highlight these issues. I'll start with you, Deputy Minister Tupper, if that's okay, to talk a little bit perhaps about how you manage the relationships between the RCMP and their contract policing with First Nations in the various negotiation agreements that you enter, and then with the federal government in terms of providing resources.
I think the basis of the relationship that we have starts with our discussions at the federal, provincial, territorial level. And so we have a table that we construct with the provinces and territories that kind of lead the way in terms of our overall negotiations for the contract and for all of the other aspects of the interactions that occur across orders of government in this regard. So we have a very well-formulated, a mature table that has a fairly steady cycle in which we engage on these issues. And indeed, I think it's in May, I have my next round where we will engage on these very issues, and the Auditor General's report is a subject that will allow us to kind of confront the need, particularly for better reporting. Part of our struggle is provinces don't report to the federal government, and so we need to find a better collaborative way to pull together the data that is in the hands of provinces and territories, that is certainly in the hands of my department and in the hands of the RCMP. And we need to construct, I think, the proper platforms that allow us to do the proper analytics that have been short over the lifetime of this program.
Thank you. And can you outline for us which provinces you're having difficulty bringing to the table?
I would say we don't have any difficulty bringing provinces to the table. The provinces and territories confront the same challenge that at the federal government level we do. Fiscal frameworks, the realities of kind of priority setting across an agenda at a provincial or territorial level. And so it's a bit cyclical in the sense of some provinces are more active in a given year than others, simply by the choices that they make. And that is why we sometimes end up with money being left on the table, because provinces make choices about how they handle the priorities that they expend resources on.
So this meeting that's happening in May, do you have a list of priorities that you will be bringing in terms of building those partnerships?
Well, the number one priority will be to follow up on the recommendations that have been articulated for us, to present our management action plan and to see if we can scope in provincial activities into that action plan to make it more complete. And I think first and foremost, frankly, to build the data sets that we need to simply do better on. We do want to talk to them about the essential service legislation. We want to make sure that we sustain their general approval or agreement in terms of the direction we're heading. They are concerned that we're striking legislation, or potentially will be striking legislation, that it is in an area of exclusive provincial domain. And so we need to kind of make sure that as we articulate that legislation, that it is done in a way that applies to the federal government and does not impose on the jurisdiction of the province and territories.
So speaking of provincial jurisdiction, I know the RCMP through contract policing does significant work. In fact, the majority of their resources end up going into contract policing as opposed to federal policing, which is also part of their mandate. How do you support the RCMP and manage their work and how they interact with communities?
So operationally, I don't support them at all because they have a very strict and strong independence in terms of operational matters, in terms of how they conduct their business. A lot of their priorities at a provincial or territorial level are struck by the provincial and territorial government, and that is between them. Where I need to have a relationship with the RCMP on the contract is with respect to how the contract works. The ability when provinces identify need for additional resources, they write to the RCMP and to ourselves and identify kind of those building blocks. So there is a constant interaction of the three parties, but operationally that is left between the province and the RCMP.
Thank you. And Deputy Commissioner Larkin, how do you frame the relationship and with First Nations communities and also with public safety, and how do you measure success? What is your measure of success as you operate in these communities?
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I'll start and then turn it over to Assistant Commissioner Brown to focus on the Indigenous piece because he's the national leader supporting that. But as Deputy Tupper alluded to, each of our provinces and territories where we're the police of jurisdiction and or municipalities have a leadership team. So we engage provincially with our public safety, Solicitor General, community safety colleagues to set priorities around the province. We look at crime severity, we look at patterns and trends and some of the public disorder challenges that are ongoing, and that liaises. We do have a national deputy commissioner that supports a number of the provinces and territories, and we also have a deputy commissioner in British Columbia and Alberta due to the large size of the deployment of RCMP members in those provinces. And so our priorities are set based at the localized level, whether that be provincial, municipal, and then equally that is also turned into the Indigenous communities that we provide policing support towards. And again, there's that national function. And one of the commissioner's priorities was to launch a full-time senior executive, particularly around Indigenous pieces. Around your comments around success, we do have performance measurements, departmental results that we do look at. Those are divvied up across the country based on the area, whether we're the provincial police of jurisdiction, the municipal police service of jurisdiction, and or we also have departmental results at the federal level within federal policing and specialized policing. But specifically to Indigenous, I'll turn to Assistant Commissioner Brown as that falls within his responsibility.
Actually, Mr. Brown, I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're just well over our time, but I'm sure we'll come back to you. Encore une fois, c'est Monsieur Lemire. Vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes.
Once again, Mr. Lemire for 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Morin, Mr. Tupper, the auditor's report talks about a lack of equity in the funding of this. Some communities should have received more money. Some received less. So can there be some kind of historic catch-up if the communities don't have the ability to open up a service, and so maybe later on there would be a need to invest more? So is there some mechanism in place to allow for that kind of a catch-up?
Madame Morin.
So just with respect to those funding decisions, and I think this is something that the Auditor General spoke to when she mentioned the fact that some of our funding decisions are based on past funding decisions. The nature of the program provides funding to police officers, and that requires us to earmark that money in a year and for all future years, because we know that that police officer will be in place. So in terms of the equity piece, it's important for us to bear in mind that we are looking at cost matching with the province. All of the services that we have, the 36 police services in the self-administered stream, are expected to meet the standards that are in place in the jurisdiction where they are operating. So they are all doing that, some of which are more difficult for them to make it work. As the Deputy Commissioner has mentioned, some of them are operating in very remote areas. We continue to try to stabilize those self-administered police services. We continue to try to drive decisions that will ensure that they have the funds that they need to have stability, predictability, and to strategically plan moving into the future. They are struggling at times to recruit, like all police services, and we want to ensure that what we're doing is being there for them to ensure that they're playing that role that we see they play in the policing ecosystem, in community safety. And that's part of the equity piece as well, is the recognition by other police services as to the role that they're playing and how they are operating interchangeably.
La politique fédérale mentionne que la règle est...
The federal policy said that the rules are pretty rigid. They pay 52% and the province pays 48%. So what happens when the province can't increase their funding? Does that have an effect on the equity?
So that's an absolute limiting factor for us. We are obliged to follow provincial jurisdiction in that regard. And so if the province is unable to match funding or chooses not to, we cannot act unilaterally in that respect.
Et voilà. Merci beaucoup. Suivant, Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you. Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My question will be directed to the two RCMP representatives. Have either of you ever heard of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Persons?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, I have.
Mr. Chair, yes, I have.
Which calls to justice have you responded to? Mr. Larkin, starting.
Actually, I'm going to turn it over to Assistant Commissioner Brown as the national lead.
Sorry, Mr. Larkin. This is a national inquiry into the police, not just the Indigenous unit that you can silo this into and say it's Mr. Brown's problem. Mr. Larkin, it's important that if you don't know, to just say you don't know. Mr. Larkin, have you read the inquiry, the national inquiry?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, I have. And I apologize for turning it over to Assistant Commissioner Brown. This is a priority for the RCMP Commissioner, and obviously Assistant Commissioner Brown can provide specifics. I don't have that information at my fingertips or have full knowledge of that. However...
Do you even know how many recommendations there are to the RCMP?
I actually do not know the exact number, how many recommendations, but I can tell you that the Commissioner has created a Reform and Accountability Directorate to track all of the various recommendations, because there's been numerous reports, numerous recommendations to the RCMP.
Do you know how disappointing that is to hear, Mr. Larkin, for Indigenous people, particularly the families of murdered and missing Indigenous people, that you can't even name one of them? Can you name one of the recommendations?
Again, I will have Assistant Commissioner Brown.
No, Mr. Larkin, I'm talking to you.
Question.
Can you name one? If you don't know, you could say I don't know.
I do not have that.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So out of the 231 recommendations, it becomes very complex. Some are provided directly towards the RCMP. Some are provided to our stakeholders, and some are provided in combination between us and others.
Do you know how many directly pertain to the RCMP?
I can't provide an exact number, but I believe it would be around 30.
I believe you might be discussing the TRC or another report, but the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women has a specific chapter dedicated to the RCMP, has 10. Could you name one of them?
Yeah, I can name one of them.
Sure,
so,
please. Which one are you working on?
So Mr. Chair, just for your confidence, I'm not confused with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where there's 96 recommendations. And a springboard from that is a direct quote from Justice Murray Sinclair in 2015. We must turn 150 years of negativity into generations of positivity. On that, Mr. Speaker, we have provided a guide for missing and murdered women, for victims of homicide, as well as a guidebook for missing women. We're presently having that translated into a number of different languages, including several Indigenous languages across Canada. So that's just one.
Public safety
Thank you.
said.
Mr. Digitally, that is the time. We will come back to you, certainly. Turning to Mr. Nader, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, thank you to our witnesses for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to begin my questions to Public Safety Canada, and if I have time, I may have a couple for the Auditor General and for the RCMP. Mr. Tupper, in the Auditor General's report, there were some fairly critical comments directed towards Public Safety Canada, specifically around documentation and justifying where things were spent. One of the quotes from Section 3.22 was this: the department did not know how much of the additional program funding it had allocated to the specific self-administered police service agreements and community tripartite agreements, and it did not know what amount of funding remained to be allocated. That's a pretty critical comment that Public Safety Canada couldn't figure out where the money went. I mean, it was justified here. He didn't have a modernized information technology system, but an Excel spreadsheet could have probably done the same thing. And I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, but I mean it's fairly concerning. And it goes on in Section 3.24, talking about the review. It says, according to Public Safety Canada, the department last performed a review in 2018-2019, 6 years ago. Continue on, of RCMP expenditures to ensure that funds were used for the program. However, the department could not provide documentation of this review. So I want to comment from you on those two elements to begin with. First, financial management and accountability. Where did these funds actually go? Can you give us any update on how public safety is tracking funds? And second, have you found that review from 2018-19? Is there any documentation within the department of the 2018-19 review?
With respect to your first question, so I concede our data system was inadequate, is inadequate in terms of our ability to produce accurate and reports. Those are things that we have already started to undertake and document our ability to track that money in a clearer way. And those are things that we will be able to invest in and start to build up. I'm not going to make any excuse, having said earlier, I was in a different capacity, but in the department when the first review was done, and I remember thinking, how is it possible that we've gone since 1996 without updating the policy? And now I'm shaking my head and saying, how is it possible we went another 10 years and still haven't done it? That is work that we have underway now. That is work that we will resolve. That is work that I have as a challenge across my department in terms of our ability to track data and make sure that we have the ability to access it and produce it in a timely way. With respect to the 2018 review, Chris, I don't know what the answer is in terms of whether we have now found it.
I cannot say that we have found it. We do know that it happened, and we know that we are taking the steps that emanated from that, and part of that is leading to better tracking, which paradoxically is sometimes leading to greater surpluses because we know better what is happening on the ground.
So, Mr. Chair, I will take an undertaking to actually resolve the question once and for all. Whether or not I can find it, if I may, we will go back, we will do a concerted effort and see if we can produce the report for the committee.
Thank you. We'll look for that. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Tupper, for that. And I do look forward to that. And I do look forward to, at some point, getting some clear timelines on when these updates are going to happen within the department. I just concerning, having been on this committee for not a relatively short period of time, under the public safety portfolio, Public Safety Canada itself, but then also CBSA, seems to have a real problem with documentation and tracking of information. And I'm not asking a question at this point, but I'm just putting out there that there is a real concern about where this portfolio is going in terms of documentation and justifying where things have happened. I'm going to leave it there because I'm going to run out of time, but I want to turn to the RCMP. There was a standing committee report on Indigenous from Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada from 2021, June 2021. And the recommendation at the time was that the Government of Canada recommend that the RCMP conduct a thorough review of their hiring process and practices to recognize and address any systemic barriers that have had a negative impact on the hiring or selection of Indigenous officers. This review would also include recognizing and addressing any systemic barriers which have led to a greater number of Indigenous officers choosing to leave the force. So that was June of 2021. We're nearly 3 years later. What is the status on that recommendation? Has the RCMP undertaken that review, and what has come out of that?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, if I may. The RCMP's Management Advisory Board has also provided similar information that we received in the fall of 2023. We also have the RCMP Indigenous Collaboration, Co-Development and Accountability Unit in 2021 to address some of those internal barriers to ensure that not only the Indigenous employees in the RCMP are provided fair and equitable opportunity, but external outreach as well. As I mentioned earlier, we've now hired a senior executive in the RCMP to oversee the First Nations, Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit recruiting strategy. That strategy is up and running as recent as January this year. As mentioned, we've seen some positive results already. We've already seen an increased number of Indigenous applicants. We've hired our very first Inuit applicant in over 10 years. We're seeing cohorts. We've gone into Indigenous communities, and we've heard time and time again that Indigenous employees do much better when they're with other Indigenous cadets and employees. So we're seeing benefit from that. So I think we've come a long way.
Thank you very much. I turn now to Ms. Yep. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for coming. And this is a difficult topic. Mr. Tupper, could you please provide an update on engagement with Nunavut and Inuit communities regarding the program? Are there any conversations or negotiations happening to bring the program to these communities?
Right now, the major part of our authorities are to focus on First Nations communities, that is with specific regard to the development of the legislation, with a clear intent that we would follow up with Inuit communities to pursue a similar track with them. In terms of the program development, I will turn to Ms. Moran to elaborate further.
Thank you. So Nunavut has just acceded to the program for the first time since its inception, and we are in the midst of rolling out community tripartite agreements in collaboration with the territory as well as the communities there. I will just note that the program itself works slightly differently in the territories due to the fact that communities are often integrated, so it does require a slightly different conversation. And so the short answer to your question is yes, we are engaging now. We've been starting that conversation over the last few months. I would say it will intensify in the next 6, probably.
I understand in Nunavut there are, I believe, 22 or 25 communities roughly. And is that what you meant by it's a little different?
I mean that this program is designed to operate on reserve. And so in the territories where you have communities that are integrated or are not specifically a reserve, the program does operate differently. We have community tripartite agreements that serve cities where people are integrated, and we're ensuring that there is a culturally responsive complement of officers that are available for Inuit people who are living in the city, and we will ensure that that reporting is made public as we roll those out.
Thank you. Mr. Larkin, in your opening statement, you said the RCMP is committed to addressing systemic racism and discrimination while remaining dedicated to strengthening trust with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples, communities, and employees. How is this being addressed? It seems like it's a difficult balance there.
Thank you for the question through you, Mr. Chair. There's a number of activities that are ongoing across the organization as we've actually reconstructed and rebuilt our professional responsibility office, which oversees our values and ethics. Obviously continue to enhance our complaint system as well as our accountability system. That's included and tied to modernizing our training at Depot, which ensures more than 40 hours of culturally sensitive training specific to Indigenous communities. Assistant Commissioner Brown can provide more information, however, before a recruit leaves Depot, if they're being assigned to a First Nation community, there's a training guide as well as an understanding of where they're heading within our vast country and our very unique communities that we provide service to. But equally on the other side, we've been focused on accountability through enhancing our character-based leadership, our supervisory training, as well as our executive development program so that leaders that come through the organization ensure that we actually change the course. Again, I want to recognize, we do recognize our historical role in the colonization, and the RCMP, as we look to the future, obviously needs to continue the work that we're doing to build trust, and so we want to recognize that. So there's a series of individual pieces. Reform and accountability is a new directorate which is taking the last decade of numerous recommendations around the RCMP, around enhancing and supporting and delivering better policing services to the citizens of Canada, as well as focused on culturally sensitive work, addressing internal systemic barriers. As Assistant Commissioner Brown indicated, we've been revamping our recruitment process. So there's a numerous number of different pieces that are ongoing. Warren, I don't know if you want to add anything to that response.
Mr. Chair, I think additionally we have an anti-racism unit now embedded within our Chief Human Resource Office. We are looking at a pilot project nationally right now for race-based data collection. So that's the perception of police officers when dealing with people that they encounter in community and whatnot. So we're hoping to learn from those experiences and just become better.
Is there any language training? Indigenous language training?
That's a very good question, Mr. Speaker. So yes, we're looking at implementing recognition for those employees who endeavor to learn Indigenous language in communities, albeit our tenure is often very short in some of the more remote locations. We're looking to see if we could find some sort of a retention and attraction strategy for that. Certainly, it's what our Indigenous communities want to see. We have some guidebooks with some plain language, some diagram, whatnot. So we're looking at programs to fill that gap. But certainly, that's a recommendation that we've also heard from the Commissioners' Indigenous Advisory Committee. So those are programs underway. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Beginning our third round, Mr. Blake, I understand you're taking the official opposition spot. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to thank my Conservative colleagues for the opportunity to use their time. A 2014 Public Safety Canada report acknowledged systemic violence when one service organization reported that, quote, an encounter with the police means arrest or rape. Do you understand the gravity of the violence your institution has perpetrated and continues to perpetrate?
Through you, Mr. Chair, certainly, yes, we understand the challenges and the history of our organization, and much of the work that we're doing is to actually look towards the future of enhancing that trust. And so, in short, yes, we do.
You know, we've heard these kinds of responses before. I'm a young member of Parliament. I've been here 3 years. I've heard that statement time and time again. And it becomes a question as to when that actually takes place. And I find that institutions only respond to force. That when it comes to why you won't do these things, it's, well, we'll look to the future. But who can't look to the future are those children, the little girls who go missing, the women who are murdered, and the people's families who are left behind. They can't wait for that, Mr. Larkin. The question becomes to the government, at what point do we just call it quits and say the RCMP is corrupt? We need to start over. We have to seriously ask that question. When it comes to institutions that fail us, we require a very serious and a very important review of the actual work the RCMP does. If your trust is so incredibly broken, Mr. Larkin, you've acknowledged that, at what point can a partner continue to beg for proper protection? When you can't even guarantee 3 days ago, one of your officers was charged with child exploitation. Who holds you accountable, Mr. Larkin?
Through you, Mr. Chair, first, there's a number of initiatives that are ongoing to actually address a series of recommendations that have...
Sorry, I have limited time. Who holds the RCMP accountable?
Well, the Commissioner does report to the Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you very much. That's an important piece to it. The Minister of Public Safety is aware of this? Deputy Minister, have you responded or have you met with the Minister of Public Safety in regard to these serious concerns?
So the minister would deal more directly with the RCMP as part of that operational organization. That
have you advised that the RCMP should be held accountable for this?
I have not.
Thank you for your honesty. It's important that we have honest representatives to this fact. Will you commit to bring this serious matter up to the minister? If it's the minister's job to hold the RCMP accountable, will you please inform him of this emergency? Children can't wait. We can't wait for this moment, for this future beautiful time. Countless victims are awaiting justice. Will you commit to inform the minister that we need a process of immediate accountability and a process to inform justice and a review of the RCMP's conduct from the top?
Mr. Chair, I commit to raising these issues with my minister.
Thank you very much. I do want to move now to an issue related to funding. Public safety holds funds because they're attached to older funding models from First Nations, and allowing provinces and territories to lead these funding models goes against the constitutional rights of First Nations. Consultation with First Nations is imperative. How do we intend to fix this issue, Deputy Minister?
So for the past 2 years, we have been out engaging with communities. Mr. Chair,
have you read the Constitution in terms of whose jurisdiction? You've commented on the jurisdiction several times. Have you read the section of the Constitution entitled Section 9124?
The sections that define federal responsibility towards Indian people and Indian lands?
Yep.
Yes.
Have you read that? And so why is it that a federal government who has whole and woolly jurisdictional power on First Nations reserves is using the excuse of a jurisdictional barrier by a province?
Well, because it's not an excuse, Mr. Chair. The reality is that the administration of justice is a provincial responsibility. We cannot go into provincial territory and implement laws or construct organizations that are outside the bounds of provincial and territorial law. That is also defined in the Constitution. So we work with the provinces, and that is why the 52...
Who suffers from this? Football passing, jurisdictional football passing.
I don't believe, Mr. Chair, that it's football passing.
The courts have ruled several times, actually. They've used that
that we have a split in the funding that recognizes a 52% contribution from the federal government.
The AFN has said they've been stonewalled by your ministry. Will you meet with the AFN,
with the provinces
Mr.
and
Tupper?
territories?
Will you meet with the AFN on the funding?
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. We will be right back to you shortly. I'm going to call time out there. We are over our time. Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. I was just wondering, Mr. Larkin, we've dealt before with the shortage of RCMP officers and the difficulty in recruiting to remote areas. I was just wondering how much pay affects it. Can you perhaps elaborate what the pay rates for RCMP is with respect to provincial forces or municipal forces? Might that be a factor?
Mr. Chair, if I may. I can't get into specifics regarding pay. I do know that the RCMP, since we have been unionized, we're more comparable now with other similarly sized police forces across Canada. There are pay and benefits that I won't speak to from other police jurisdictions and provincial areas. So I believe now that our pay is more in line with other police departments in Canada, it has provided more opportunity for experienced police officers to join the RCMP, as well with our robust and aggressive hiring practices. We're seeing an increase in the number of people that we're having in the depot. So I anticipate that we're on a positive path forward to addressing some of our vacancies.
Okay, and can you elaborate on what the RCMP is doing specifically to increase public confidence and trust with our Indigenous communities?
Well, we have a number of programs underway. So again, primarily the Commissioner has his Indigenous Advisory Committee. So those are representatives from each province and territory to provide the Commissioner and myself, who's the chair of that committee, direction on what types of programs they would like to see in their communities. I think a gap that the audit had identified is that the RCMP were not a signatory to the CTAs. So I'm hoping that as we move forward in our management action plans that we can provide more input and feedback from the communities on the type of policing they'd like to see. We've identified that the CTA primarily under the FNIPP program is for enhanced policing. However, some of the communities, because we have built trust and confidence through those enhanced positions, they would like to see those police officers take on more of a core duty and responsibility. So I think by addressing some of those issues that we're in a better place. The commanding officers, so those who are in charge of each division as well, have their own advisory committees. So again, we have reporting elements in place for the detachments to meet frequently with Indigenous communities. So it's that consultation and feedback from the communities that provides us our direction.
Okay, and Mr. Tupper now, how does the public, first of all, I was wondering if you could explain like how you plan to bridge the gap between the two types of agreements. We keep referring to, the different service deliveries. You've got the two types of programs to ensure that there's equal and equitable access and service delivery across all communities. You've got the tripart agreements, and then you've got the self-governing ones. And also I'm interested to know in how you can encourage more communities to adopt the self-governing model.
Well, first of all, we need to be out there working with communities and hear from them in terms of whether or not they want to adopt that model, and that has to do with where they're located and the other resources that they have available to them. I think our goal over time, and particularly if we succeed at getting legislation in place, that it will start to define that path forward in terms of transitioning communities into more independent policing arrangements. But as I say, those will be choices that communities need to make, and that is part of the work that we're doing now, is to ascertain what that demand will be.
And also, I understand that, the reason there's so many funds left over is because provinces or territories aren't stepping up and contributing their fair share. Could you elaborate as to which provinces and territories are not participating in the cost sharing?
So again, Mr. Chair, it's not so much that they're not stepping up. They make different choices through the funding cycles. All of the provinces and territories engage with us in this program. All of them invest in various ways in the program. They make choices about what priorities that they make, and that may be choosing between communities in terms of where they invest and where they don't invest. And it may simply be choices they make in terms of whether they augment the funding available in their programs overall. I want to be clear, provinces and territories are our partners in this program. We have a positive relationship with all of the provinces and territories in this work. It is an area of demand. Community safety is an area of demand where more investment could be made. I also want to kind of point out that it is not just policing that will be the issue in a lot of these communities. What we are doing through community safety planning, what we're doing in terms of crime prevention, what we do with respect to youth programming, gangs and drugs programming, those are all elements of how we invest in communities, and particularly Indigenous communities, to try and change, bend the data that we see in terms of crime rates. And all of those things work together and will all together define what our success is. It won't be just one investment through policing or any of those other programs I just mentioned.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Suivant encore, c'est Monsieur Lemire.
Once again, it's Mr. Lemire for 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Larkin, I'd like to know, have you had discussions with public safety on the way in which you can recognize and make Indigenous policing services essential? So could you share with the committee how that might look?
Mr. Speaker, thank you for that. I would start off by saying, again, Mr. Tupper referred to earlier that the provinces and territories are responsible for the tempo, if you will, and the priorities for policing in that specific area. The RCMP, our primary concern is to ensure that all communities, public safety is the number one priority. And we would endeavor to support whatever program the provinces and territories under our contract would suit them best. So we would be nimble. It's not a one-size-fit-all, and no, as I said earlier, no two Indigenous communities are the same. So there's specific needs that some may have that others might have other priorities. So it becomes a little bit more of a complex, but certainly the RCMP are at the table to make sure that whatever service we provide, it meets the community's needs the best.
J'aimerais vous entendre davantage sur
I'd like to hear you speak more about the prioritizing of these Indigenous policing services. What have you done to develop capacity within these communities? Do you have regular exchanges with the Department of Public Safety? There seems to be a will on the side of Indigenous nations to see changes. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, thank you. And the Auditor General has identified that gap. And, that's a gap through our management action plan that we hope we can sustain. I would, if I may, talk about our national reconciliation pathway that might assist. As we renew our priorities and commitments for reconciliation, we continue to embrace the phrase, nothing about us without us, ensuring the inclusion of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit voices, perspectives, and advice in new and innovative ways of working together. This includes efforts to decolonize policing and enforcement through engagement and applying an Indigenous GBA plus lens, and review all policies, practices, and procedures to ensure service delivery is culturally appropriate. As well, the RCMP will use trauma-informed approach across all the organization's functions to increase safety for Indigenous women and girls. I would summarize your question by saying when it is time to look at the renewal of CTAs, the RCMP would certainly like to be part of that conversation at the table.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just following up on my last round in relation to funding, Mr. Tupper, I don't believe your argument that this is a provincial jurisdictional issue will hold up in court. Jordan's principle is a good example of not too long ago, another deputy minister said the exact same thing. It's the provinces who are holding it. It's the provinces. But luckily enough, Indigenous people fought the government, and now Indigenous children have the opportunity to actually live in this country. Because the answer to my question of who suffers the jurisdictional football passing, it's Indigenous people. I'm confident that should your analysis and advice to the government be challenged by a court, that you'll lose that decision and Indigenous people will yet again win, just like we do most in cases at the Supreme Court when it comes to jurisdictional battles. And so I suggest that the Ministry of Justice should give you more advice, better advice, as to what the constitutional promises and the constitutional limits of Canada are and their relationship to Indigenous people. Because I fundamentally disagree that we should continue to suffer under a model that says jurisdiction has to take a front seat to lives of Indigenous people. I do now want to turn to the fact that Indigenous police services have to fight tooth and nail for the minimum funding. In early spring of 2023, funding negotiations between the federal government and the Indigenous Policing Services of Ontario fell through. March 29th, the Indigenous Police Chiefs of Ontario, who represent 9 standalone Indigenous services, filed a human rights complaint against Public Safety Canada, claiming underfunding and under-resourcing of Indigenous police services accounted to systemic racism. The funding agreements officially expired on March 31st, 2023. Are you aware of this, Mr. Tupper?
I am indeed, yes.
Why are there different funding models and terms and conditions when it comes to Indigenous versus non-Indigenous policing models?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Why are there different funding models and terms and conditions when it comes to Indigenous versus non-Indigenous policing models?
So I don't negotiate non-Indigenous policing models. So you are correct, and I am absolutely aware of the case that is before the courts now. We have tried genuinely to engage with the community. We have arrived at an impasse in terms of our understanding of the funding that we have available and how we can close an agreement with that community. We have reached an impasse. They have chosen to pursue a legal solution to that. I appreciate your earlier comments, sir, with respect to where the courts may go. And at this point in time, I think I can only comment that we will see how this gets itself resolved in the courts.
I want to note the court did rule against you already on this.
And it is under appeal.
Why are you appealing it?
Because we disagree with the original court position.
Who suffers?
I appreciate the communities. Mr. Chair, I do appreciate the difficulty of what
Mr. Tupper, who suffers?
The participants, the members of communities.
Thank you.
Mr. That is your time, I'm afraid. I'm going to go now to Mr. Lillo. You have the floor. I understand you're going to be splitting your time with Mr. Nader. Would you like me to split you halfway, or are you going to turn it over to him?
I'll turn it there.
That's fine. Just want to be clear, sure we're clear. Over to you. 5 minutes, please.
5 minutes, Chair? Thank you. Thank you again to the witnesses for being here and taking part in such an important discussion. I want to come back to the negotiations in terms of these important funding agreements. The Auditor General's report, Mr. Tupper, mentioned that many communities did not feel engaged, that the negotiations were not true negotiations, and that the federal government was coming to the table already with predetermined funding allocations. So why is it that this is happening? It seems that your department is not negotiating necessarily in good faith.
Mr. Chair, I think there is a question of practice, which isn't a great answer in the sense of we have done it in the past that way, and we've continued to do it in the past or in the present that way. I think one of the efforts that we are trying to pursue in the department is that concentration of expertise and programming in one single place. I think our desire is indeed to be able to expand the kind of work that we do, to be able to engage more directly with and consistently with communities, to not rely on just the cycles of how these agreements work, but rather to kind of make sure that we have a much more consistent engagement with communities. So we learn in between funding decisions, we learn what the needs of communities are, and that gets reflected in the next round of discussions. That, I think, is something that will allow us to say that we are actually engaging in a better way with community leadership.
Understood. Now, have you taken any specific concrete measures in that regard that you can point to?
Well, we started with, as I say, bringing the entirety of my Indigenous activities within the department together. That has translated into some of our regional organizations so that I have people on the ground now. They will be more accessible to community leadership, and I think that that's a really important part of that, is that people are present, that it's not kind of a fly-in, fly-out sort of relationship.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll move on to another topic with limited time, I'm sure, as you can appreciate. Mr. Tupper, I'll stick with you, though. The report also found that equitable funding is not defined by Public Safety Canada, and that, a quote here, that there was not an approach to allocate funds equitably to program recipients. We've heard that a bit already. So could you speak to why equitable funding does not have a specific definition, and what the department's doing to rectify that?
On the latter part of the question, Mr. Chair, next month, as we engage with our partners in this, that has to be a part of it, is as we collectively look at the Auditor General's report and we understand the kinds of actions that we need to take to address the recommendations that have been made, that will be a part of the conversation. That equity is something that we have to share in terms of who the funders are and how we work with communities.
Okay, appreciate that. Just one more quick question before I turn the floor over to Mr. Nader. Again, Mr. Tupper, to you. Public Safety Canada, according to the Auditor General report, does not keep an accurate listing of the community agreements, the tripartite agreements. Do you have any response to that?
May I turn to you, Chris?
You may, thank you. If you will permit me, Mr. Chair, I'd like to add a point about the equitable distribution, and part of the challenges with that is because the program does serve two very different types of policing, one being self-administered, one being community tripartite agreement. And the size of those self-administered services are quite different. We have some that are quite small and some that are very, very large by policing standards, which creates challenges. With respect to a single list, we use a database for program delivery, and it is true that there may not have been one single Excel spreadsheet, for example, with a listing, but it is not accurate that we do not know where that funding is going and who gets it.
Thank you for that. Unfortunately, I have to stop you there because I did promise Mr. Nader some of my time, so I'll turn the floor over to him.
Thank you, Chair. In the very brief time, hopefully we can deal with this very quickly, but I'd like to move the motion that I have on notice from last week, that in relation to the committee's ongoing work on government contracting and further to the information provided by the Treasury Board Secretariat on April 12, 2024, the committee order, A, the production of copies of the 140 conflict of interest declarations filed in the 2022-23 fiscal year and the 162 conflict of interest declarations filed in the 2023-24 fiscal year concerning public servants employed in the core public administration who were involved in contractual relationships with the Government of Canada. B, the production of copies of any conflict of interest declarations filed in 2022, 2023, and 2023-2024 fiscal years by persons employed by the federal government, including Crown corporations, but outside of the core public administration, who were involved in contractual relationships with the Government of Canada. And C, the production of records which detail all payments made in respect of the contractual relationships disclosed in the declarations referred to in paragraph A and B, provided that D, the names and contact information of the public servants may be redacted. E, For greater certainty, no redactions shall be applied to the names of contracting entities or the value of the contractual relationship disclosed, including, where multiple relationships are disclosed, the value of each contractual relationship disclosed, and F, these documents, with only the redactions authorized by paragraph D, shall be deposited with the clerk of the committee in both official languages. 1. In the case of the documents referred to in paragraphs A and B within 21 days of the adoption of this order, and 2, in the case of documents referred to in paragraph C within 35 days of the adoption of this order. Chair, I would just briefly comment that, the article we saw in La Presse today just gives us further motivation for this information. It's been provided to us in a spreadsheet with just the sheer numbers. This is simply getting more information from the Treasury Board Secretariat with the appropriate redactions. I think this is incumbent on this to do this, and hopefully we can get consensus around table to pass this quickly.
I was going to ask you, Mr. Any chance you have consensus from your colleagues around the table? First and foremost, I have to seek unanimous consent to continue for 15 minutes. A little louder? No. I'm going to. The meeting will be adjourned in 1 second. I just want to thank our witnesses for coming in today. All of you, I appreciate it. I understand there'll be some information forthcoming that can be sent to the committee clerk. For subcommittee members, a reminder: we'll be meeting back here.
Yes.
Back here right after the votes. This meeting is adjourned.